ideally policy should be such that it boosts and incentivizes economic activity, not acting as yet another brake on that activity.
South Africa's roads are crumbling. Joining me to discuss the impact that this will have on South Africa's economy is Chris Hattingh of the IRR. But before we start with this interview, just a quick reminder to please like this video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We release a new video every weekday morning at 6 a.m. So Chris, what has caused this decay in South Africa's road infrastructure, and what impact is this having on the economy?
So as the country's rail network has declined in reliability and safety, more and more farmers, freight operators, manufacturers, industrialists, mining companies, pretty much everyone across supply and value chains, they've had to rely more on road transport. Now, that, of course, increases pressure on South Africa's roads, as I'm sure many people, now that the country has opened up again and they can travel around the country, they will see, especially between Gauteng and KZN, where some roads and the Free State as well have deteriorated in terms of quality and safety. That's because there's simply more trucking happening on South Africa's roads. Those containers that container ships can move, hundreds of at the same time. In South Africa, we have trucks that can transport maybe one of them at a time. And when you have that amount of containers and trucks, that's a lot of weight on the roads. And if you don't do maintenance properly, if you don't use municipal resources for that road maintenance, then the road infrastructure crumbles. When you have increased weather, increased intense weather patterns, so rain, for example, as we're seeing in Gauteng at the moment, then you expose the roads even more to wear and tear, and that means, again, increased safety issues. So those costs are passed on to all of those players that I mentioned early on, again, the farmers, the manufacturers, etc. They have to pay more maybe when they hit potholes. They have to pay more to ensure that their goods that they're transporting is secure and safe. They have to take extra safety measures, maybe paying private security companies or something like that, because they also can't rely on the police necessarily. They know that the army will be called in when there's maybe riots and that kind of thing, but you can't always rely on the army to cover the whole country, of course. So all of those things affect companies' operational ability. They have to factor in those risks and costs into the price of their goods and services. And in turn, that's then passed on to the South African consumer. Now, low to middle income consumers are heavily reliant, especially on cheaper foodstuffs, on cheaper goods and materials. And then when those companies are forced to pay more for security or transport and infrastructure, they have to factor that into their operations. So everyone eventually has to bear those costs.
So Chris, can we zoom into the agricultural sector specifically? How are these infrastructure problems impacting on farmers?
Right. So there's one survey specifically that I think we can highlight, and that provides a useful glimpse into that world. This is a survey done by AgriSA of 311 farms, and it found that 94% of agricultural produce is transported by road, while research by Agbiz showed that the share of South Africa's maize and wheat transported by rail dropped from around 35% in 2006 to about 5% in 2021. I mean, that's a marked decrease and quite significant, I think. It points to both the fact that the rail simply doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's been stolen and taken for other purposes, but also the reliability is an issue. So you can't move your maize and wheat. Once you've sort of farmed it and you've got your crop, it needs to be moved and stored. You can't have it just sitting in freight containers and sort of trucks in railway stations for months on end. You need to move things quickly to make sure that it's stored properly and that consumers can buy it when they need it. And of course, that you get a profit for it as the farmer who took the risk of investing all that much capital and trying to make sure that you can actually sustain your own farm and your family and your business going forward. So despite the shift from rail to road that I mentioned from the Agbiz report, deteriorating road conditions mean that each farmer has to bear an additional cost, averaging about 200,000 Rand in 2021. Now, this puts the total cost to the industry at between 6 billion and 8 billion. And importantly, agriculture contributes about 14% of South Africa's GDP. Now, we often talk about tourism, manufacturing, how important that is, but I don't think people often keep in mind how important agriculture is and just how difficult it is for farmers to operate, never mind the threat of expropriation without compensation. It's basic things such as moving your sort of produce across the country's roads.
All right, Chris, and earlier you mentioned some of the governance and capacity problems at the local level, and we've documented many of the collapses that are happening in municipalities across the country in many videos on this channel. What do you think is the role of local governance here in exacerbating this deterioration in South Africa's roads?
When resources intended for road maintenance and upgrading and those very basic things of municipal governance are neglected, and when that money is used, for example, for exorbitant salaries or for consultants or that kind of thing, that means that local farmers and manufacturers can't rely on their sort of networks of road infrastructure to move their goods around. A report by the Auditor General of South Africa found that irregular, unauthorized, and wasteful municipal expenditure amounted to 189 billion rand in the 2019-20 financial year. And out of 257 municipalities, only 27 or 11% achieved an unqualified audit without findings or clean audits. I mean, that really indicates how the country's municipalities are, number one, simply not doing basic governance and reporting and that kind of thing, but also not using their resources efficiently. The government loves to talk about reindustrializing the country and re-upping our manufacturing and how that's going to boost growth. I mean, South Africa needs between maybe 5 to 8% growth for the next few years to really make a good dent in the unemployment rate. But without the basics of road infrastructure and safety, you're not going to get increased manufacturing capacity. You aren't going to get increases in the agricultural sector, for example, to a significant extent. You can talk about all the localization plans that you want, but if municipalities on the very basic floor level aren't using the resources that they're allocated to, for example, upgrade road infrastructure, you can have all the sort of localization plans that you like, but it's really not going to manifest in any concrete results, unfortunately.
So, Chris, as we know, globally, we are suffering from a supply chain crunch. There is the hard lockdowns for COVID in China. We're seeing some quite dramatic scenes coming out of places like Shanghai, and that's going to impact on manufacturing. China is the workshop of the world, so that's rippling out throughout the global economy. We also have the war in Ukraine that's going to impact particularly on wheat prices. So are we as South Africa perhaps compromising our ability to deal with some of these global risks by not investing sufficiently in our infrastructure and our local import and export capacity?
No, absolutely. I think we can point to the many shoot yourself in the foot policies that government is pursuing and has implemented for the last few years, which makes us more brittle to global forces. Now, of course, government, we don't expect government to control the global oil price, for example, but we could be in a much better position if we had the right sort of policies in place and if we actually used our resources well, again, as you say, to maybe just upgrade basic road infrastructure, the performance of the country's ports, and of course, to protect the existing rail networks and upgrade those. So, for example, now South Africa could be benefiting and giving our agricultural sector especially a boost by exporting to North Africa, filling a bit of a gap that is being left by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. South Africa could be filling the gap, for example, in terms of exporting wheat and other produce to North African and Middle Eastern countries, but we simply don't have the infrastructure and the necessary safety conditions in place to make sure that we incentivize our farmers in the country to do exactly that. I mean, if the farmers are going to want to, as any business, they want to make sure that they get the best return on maybe some of the risks that they undertake, but it's a lot more risky trying to get things through the country's ports than it would be maybe moving it through the country's borders to the north. Maybe then they don't pay as much tax revenue as they would. I mean, the country's GDP, we know the country's GDP is not what it should be. We know the economy is not growing as much as we should. So ideally, policy should be such that it boosts and incentivizes economic activity, not acting as yet another brake on that activity.
Chris Hattingh, thank you very much. Let's hand over to you, our audience. How are you being impacted by the deterioration of South Africa's roads? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. My name is David Ansara. This is the CRA. Until next time, take care.